Well, Happy New Year. I know it's January 9th, but last week was our family dinner. So here we are meeting in this setting for the first time this year. And typically many people, when they think about New Year's, they think about goals for the new year. New Year's resolutions. Maybe it's a health goal, an exercise goal. Maybe it's a next step in your career. But sometimes we make for ourselves huge expectations at the New Year's or all throughout the years that just don't meet our reality. And they leave us a little disappointed. Much like a lot of times our life works out like those silly memes you see, expectations versus reality. Have you seen those on the internet? So, what you expect when you wake up and what the reality is, if you've ever had a child. Or maybe that's what you want to wake up feeling like, but that's what you really wake up feeling like. Sometimes when you bake a cake, you have an expectation. And the reality is, you don't know how to make Olaf. I'm sure it still tasted good. The perception and the reality of what we think having a sweet baby sleeping with us and what it's really like. I think little cold daggers in your back is probably what happened, was more of our reality raising children. Many of us could probably deal with the fact that our cake didn't turn out right or our kid's foot is in our back. But how do we deal with the reality that our expectations for our closest relationships don't work out like we had planned? The next 6 weeks we'll be talking about relationships and ways that we can do to improve ourselves and our relationships with others. And so when we make these expectations and they don't, and the reality of them don't meet what we expect, it can be devastating to us. When our reality clashes with what we believe the expectations of our friendships, our marriage, our family, our co-workers. And we all deal with this to some extent in our life. And so right now, and we're going to touch back on this later, but right now think of one person, maybe a friend that you always relied on, and maybe that relationship is not the same. Maybe it's a sibling, and that relationship just feels full of conflict and competition rather than love. Perhaps your marriage doesn't look like what you thought it would look like the day when you walked down the aisle. We all long for deep, meaningful relationships. And when these relationships don't meet what our expectations are, there can be deep disappointment. So my name's Ryan. I think everybody here knows that by now. But if not, I'm pastor here with the Gathering KC Church. And so the next few weeks, I hope to address the disappointment that we all feel when our relationship expectations don't meet our reality. And in the last 2 years, if we've learned nothing, hopefully we've learned that close, authentic relationships really matter. And I know for me with this church, with you guys that have been here from the start or pretty close to the start, we've built some really neat relationships. And they carry on beyond when we meet here in the walls. Text messages, phone calls throughout the week. I know my wife always is like, talking with you, with some of you women throughout the week, and I think that's cool that those relationships are building. But if we've learned anything over the last 2 years of the different segregation and lockdowns and whatever, is that authentic relationships are important. So now the purpose of this series, we want to give insight into close and meaningful relationships. My hope is that by the end of the series, we're able to give love to others better. But not only that we're able to give love, but that we're able to receive love from others more effectively. The skills we're going to learn are going to create healthy relationships that will be needed as we finish this weird pandemic season that 2 weeks never seems to be ending. And as the world continues to turn its back on God and on the church, we'll need healthy relationships with others, even just to promote our own good health and our own mental and physical health. We'll need these good relationships. And I believe fully that these relationships matter because Jesus told us that they mattered. He told us to love each other well. And again, we remember the story. We talk about it so often, but the religious leaders came up to Jesus that day and wanted to trip him up. And they asked in Matthew 23, what is the greatest commandment of all? And Jesus says that it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And then Jesus takes it a step further, right? And he says, and the second's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus takes all the commandments and he sums them up in two statements, and they go hand in hand. Because these two are connected, sometimes it becomes a roadblock to us in our spiritual maturity, and because our relational and emotional immaturity gets in the way. Pete Scazzero says that it is impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. As followers of Jesus, we want to follow this command of Jesus, so we have to look at how we do relationships. Which, have you ever looked inwardly at yourself? It's a tough one to do. Michael Jackson said that we're supposed to look at the man in the mirror and ask him if we're in need for a change. Don't worry, I got more bad references tonight. To do that, we have to be honest, and we have to be brave about what we find. Also, we have to be open. It's easy to look at what others are doing wrong, but we have to be open to see what it is that we're doing that may be contributing to create difficulty in our relationships. Thirdly, we have to be ready to take action on the things when we're going to take actions on the things that we're going to learn over the next few weeks. So to sum it up, today and the next few weeks as we talk about relationships, we need to be brave, we need to be open, and we need to be ready. So number one on this journey for us tonight is that in our relationships, we need to be able to clarify expectations. We tend to set kind of ridiculous expectations for ourselves. And perhaps it's our culture with social media that tends to do this to us. We see that others, we see what they're doing. We see their vacations, their home remodels, their DIY projects, their homes, even their food. We get to see everybody's food on social media. We get to see the Olaf cake that looks so good compared to mine that doesn't. And so social media maybe causes us to build up these crazy expectations. I mean, I know this guy who last year bought a house and thought he could build his wife an office in a week. And 7 months later, he was putting the trim up on the exterior door. I don't know, this guy's kind of close to me. So yeah, sometimes we have ridiculously high expectations for ourselves. And it just seems like the culture has set us up for high expectations in regards to what we eat, what we wear, what we drive. And then this same culture has set us up for expectations in our relationships. So the real challenge is not only that our expectations are super high, but they may be unrealistic. Our expectations may be unhealthy. And so we'll unpack that a little more and how these unrealistic and unhealthy expectations, what they look like. So let's tackle that. Many of our expectations are unconscious. There we go. Which means we don't even know that we have this expectation. Then when it's unmet, this expectation that we weren't even conscious of, we feel disappointed, hurt, and angry. Like, you just expect maybe your roommate or your adult child to put their dishes in the dishwasher when they're done. We maybe expect your young child to even do it at the home. Just put your dishes in the sink, put them in the dishwasher. And you've maybe never voiced it, but in your unconscious, this is an expectation you have. Because Maybe that's how it always was when you were growing up, and you just expect it to be that way. Perhaps you expect that your husband should be able to repair the car because your dad just always went out there and repaired the car. Or maybe somebody thinks mom should just always fix dinner because their mom just always fixed dinner. And they have these expectations that we don't even realize are going on in our minds sometimes. And so expectations that are unconscious are assumptions that we make because we just believe that's how the world works. I mean, everyone just knows that's how the world works. My wife's favorite saying, I'm going to throw her under the bus here. Be careful with assumptions. We know what they all turn us into. I'll leave it alone. Second one is unreasonable expectations. Sometimes when a child moves out, or there's a loss of a loved one, some kind of change in our household, we expect that others in our life will fill that void. I mean, yeah, we had our routines before, but now that they just continue going on with their routine, that just seems rude. Why didn't they stop and come deal with me and my change? So perhaps it's that our expectation is unreasonable. I always had this idea, and this was maybe my unreasonable expectation for my life. I always had this idea that I'd be old when one of my parents would pass away. I thought I'd be at least in my 60s, you know. My dad got to be old. My mom still has her parents today. She had her great-grandparents until I was an older teenager. So I just had this almost unreasonable, unconscious expectation that I would be old. And when the reality of that didn't come to be the truth, my father died from cancer while I was just in my early to mid-40s. That was a shock to me, and I didn't even realize it. So I summed up both of those expectations already. There was something going on that I didn't realize an expectation, and then it was unreasonable. It was unrealistic to what was going on in the real world at that time. Next, we have our unspoken expectations. We might be conscious of what our expectations are, but the other person, they're not aware of those expectations. As my wife tells me all the time, well, I'm just throwing you under the bus a lot tonight. Use your words, she says to me. She always tells me, use your words. And then when I don't use my words, I get upset that my unspoken expectations go unmet. And it usually happens, something remodeling the house, working on the car. I'm just like, why didn't you grab that? She goes, you didn't tell me to. So unspoken expectations. Sometimes our expectations are unhealthy because they are unagreed upon. We haven't decided together in our relationship, whatever the relationship is, that we're going to do this. I mean, just because you were invited to a party doesn't mean you go. Just because you want to leave for vacation at 6 and your wife would rather leave at 9. Like when I was off work for almost 6 months after an injury and I grew my beard long, I didn't ask her what she thought of that. She didn't think much of it. Our expectations are unagreed upon, and that can be unhealthy and can cause us some issues in our relationships. Unconscious, unreasonable, unspoken, and unagreed upon expectations are unhealthy, and they'll always go unmet. Eventually, if we don't step back and examine our expectations, we're likely to make a judgment. We're likely to make an assumption about another person. And then whenever we do that, we make a judgment or an assumption, pain and confusion will enter into that relationship. And then we'll build resentment, creating a wall between us and the other person. And I wanted to share some kind of real life story with you from that. But I'm right in the middle of it with family and with coworkers where I did that. And so hopefully soon I can tell you about how readdressed these expectations and became better at loving them. Unhealthy expectations that go unexamined and unresolved can be the basis for friendships falling apart, the disintegration of a small group, maybe work relationships come to an end, families blow up, maybe friendships collapse or marriage disintegrates. These are real things. So what can we do to create healthy relationships? So for us, we're going to look at how to create healthy relationships by looking in God's truth, God's word and scriptures. And we're going to see tonight two things that we need to stop doing. And we're going to see two things that we need to start doing. And so the first one is stop mind reading. I assume that people want the same thing as me. So I give them what I would want instead of giving them what they would want to read. You see, I'm an extrovert. I didn't know if you knew that. When we had our first guest, when we opened our Airbnb up, we had our first guest, I thought he would really appreciate my friendly gestures every day. Every day. Every day. Hi, Joseph. How are you? So, why are you running inside? Hey, come eat dinner with us. I'm grilling hamburgers. Come sit out here. Hey, every day if I saw this poor kid. Because that's what I would want. I want to include everybody. I want to be included. And I was explaining to someone how my dumbfoundedness to how he reacted to my invitations, and they pointed out that he likely isn't in the crowds and parties. He's probably more of an introvert. And that he likes to be alone in his own space. But as I sat back and I pondered that and I thought about it and I reassessed that, I go, yeah, he doesn't need what I need. He needs his space. He needs to come to me and tell me that he wants to be a part. Or he needs to allow me in. I need to put force myself upon him and try and include him the way I want to be. I need to listen and be aware of what this person needs. So often, we just think that we know what people need or want. So then we make assumptions. So Scripture gives a clear warning about mind reading. Proverbs 18:2 says, "Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." The poet Cameo worded it this way: "They try to put on their airs and act real cool, but you've got to realize that they're acting like a fool." You didn't know you could quote Cameo to Scripture, huh? Maybe we just don't want to take the time to understand someone else. So instead, we just assume their opinions and preferences are just like ours. I know at 20 years old, I thought everybody must think like me. Everybody. And how shook I became when I found out the world was full of people with different ideas. Different ways of doing the same thing. It's mind-blowing. The second thing we want to stop doing is making judgments. And now, when you say stop making judgments, a lot of people's minds go a lot of places. We're going to be pretty specific here. And Jesus said it like this in Matthew 7. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." And so we end up doing this all the time, right? They call it a fundamental attribution error. This occurs when I judge the behavior of other people. So I attribute someone else's actions as bad character. But now if I do those same actions, then I consider the environmental factors that caused me to act that way. And so it wasn't bad character on my part, but it sure was on theirs. I put it this way. When you call or text somebody and you expect a return back right away, or an email, and they don't, you're probably going to go ahead and just say, man, they must be unorganized. Why can't they just respond to me? What is this bad character trait of theirs that they can't respond to me and return my call? But now when I don't return or call a text, I think about when I received that, man, it was at a bad time. I was really busy. I was in the middle of writing this warrant that had to be done right now, and I had to run it downtown to the judge and swear to it. And man, that was just a bad time. And so in the shuffle of everything, it just kind of got missed. That wasn't a bad character on my part. I know I was busy. So that's kind of what that idea means. So we need to stop being mind readers, and we need to stop making judgments. Now here's two things we can start doing. We can start having conversations. Proverbs 18 says that the heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out. So the only way to really know what another is thinking is to ask them questions and then shut your mouth and listen to their answers. That's what I always had to tell myself, because I'm just such a out there guy, right? When I first started doing firesides with Jimmy Nicholson years ago, probably 10, 11 years ago, that was the thing I had to learn, was ask my questions, shut my mouth, and listen and learn about the other person. Instead of making an assumption, ask them, can you explain what you meant by that? Those are things you can ask people. Can you explain what you meant by that? Can you tell me more? There were some detectives, he goes, I want to practice this new skill in asking questions of victims and things so I can get better understanding of everything that transpired. I was like, oh wow, yeah, great, I want to hear this. Yeah, let's practice. So I'm a victim. And he ran through some childhood, well, I don't know, he just asked me some questions and I'd answer and he'd say, tell me more about that. I go, this is it? That's it? But as we were going through it, it would cause me to think more and to think more about the details and build it out. And he learned more about my story by asking, not assuming that he knew what I meant, but asking me what I meant. And I think that's a great tool that we can use in conversation and building relationships. So the second thing to start doing is clarifying expectations. So we go back to the chart earlier. To establish healthy expectations, I first need to be conscious that I have expectations. What is it that I'm expecting here? Then when I become conscious of what my expectations are, I can then ask, is this expectation reasonable? Is what I expected more unicorns and rainbows, or is it realistic? A reasonable expectation is one that has been met in the past, or we know the other person has a willingness to meet that expectation. So then I understand that Michelle is willing to meet my expectation, so then when the expectation has been spoken, have I said out loud what I expect? And then lastly, we have to agree upon that expectation. Michelle often asks me, what do you plan to do tomorrow? Especially when we come up on the weekends or in the evening after I get home from work. But she knows I've got a lot going on in my head. I'm always thinking about, I could do this, I could build this, I could learn this song. She just knows my mind is, after 27 years, she's figured out my mind is, it's turning. She says, what are your expectations? What are you planning to do tomorrow? So, well, I thought I'd do this, that, and the other. And I appreciate that, because what it does is it forces us to have a communication about what our expectations are for the next day. And then she might say, well, I hoped that we could do this thing. And I can say, oh, well, let's change my plans and let's do that thing. Or she can say, well, let's not do that and let's go ahead and do this. But then our expectations are laid out. We've not only had the conversation and spoken them, we've decided what's realistic for the day, and then we've agreed upon them. This kind of checking is good because we have expectation also. We understand that we have the expectation that we're each other's primary emotional support. So there's two things we need to stop doing, and there's two things we need to start doing. Stop mind reading. Stop making judgments. Start having conversations, and start clarifying expectations. So here's our challenge. Think of that one person again who you'd like to see the relationship become more healthy. And rather than, and this kind of goes back to our forgiveness little series we did, but rather than being angry for whatever feels wrong or feels disruptive, take an honest look at your own expectations. Then compare your expectations to this chart that we made. Are they healthy or are they unhealthy? Next, set a time this week to have a conversation with that person about their expectations. Now that's a tough one. That's not going to be easy, but it will be healing.